The cold marble beneath her palms was the first thing Stephanie Reed registered. One moment she had been sitting at the head of her Christmas dinner table. The next she was on the ground, her 72-year-old body aching from the impact, looking up at the cruel face of her own son. "This place belongs to Diana now. Get out!" Nathan's voice echoed through the sudden deathly silence of the room. Just an hour before, the scene had been something out of a Norman Rockwell painting. The Reed Ranch in Dallas, their family's heart for over 40 years, was dressed in its holiday best, a magnificent pine tree, so tall its angel topper nearly brushed the vaulted wooden ceiling, glittered with a lifetime of ornaments. The fireplace crackled, casting a warm golden glow on the faces of her family. The air smelled of roasted turkey, cinnamon, and pine, the scent of Christmas, the scent of home. Stephanie had spent the entire week preparing. Her hands, though wrinkled, still knew their way around a kitchen, and her heart found joy in creating this perfect day for the people she loved most. Her grandchildren, Emily and Jacob, had helped her decorate. Emily, at 16, was whip-smart and sensitive, with her late grandfather Richard's thoughtful eyes. Jacob, at 13, was all heart, a bundle of pure, uncomplicated affection. They were her world. The Reed Construction Group had been her and Richard's life's work. They'd built it from nothing into one of Texas's most respected companies. When Richard died 2 years ago, there had been no question that Stephanie would continue as the company's heart, while their son Nathan would serve as CEO. The arrangement had worked perfectly for decades, Richard handling the vision and the deals, Stephanie managing the finances and the people. She'd hoped to recreate that balance with Nathan. "Gran, can we put this one higher?" Jacob had asked earlier that day, holding a faded homemade ornament, a small wooden frame containing a family photo from 20 years ago. Richard, robust and smiling, had his arm around a younger Stephanie. In front of them stood a teenage Nathan, awkward but happy. "Of course, sweetheart. That's one of my favorites," Stephanie had replied, her throat tightening at the memory. Sometimes she still expected to hear Richard's heavy footsteps coming through the door, to feel his warm hand on the small of her back as he leaned in to kiss her cheek. "Do you think Dad will like the decorations?" Emily had asked quietly, standing back to survey their work. Stephanie had nodded, though a shadow of doubt had crossed her mind. Nathan had changed since Richard died. He'd grown distant, more formal, seemingly uncomfortable in his childhood home. His visits had become less frequent, shorter, and nearly always involved some business matter that needed her signature. "Your father loves Christmas," she had answered, using the present tense as if to will it back into truth. "He always has." As the afternoon wore on, the staff bustled about, putting final touches on what Stephanie had planned as the perfect family Christmas. The large dining table was set with the finest china and silver, glowing under the soft light of a dozen candles. Photographs of Richard were placed prominently throughout the house, a silent tribute to the man whose absence they all felt, especially during the holidays. At exactly 6 o'clock, the doorbell rang, announcing the arrival of Nathan and his family. Stephanie straightened her emerald green dress, patted her silver hair, and went to greet them with a warm smile that belied her growing anxiety. "Merry Christmas," she called, opening the large wooden door. Nathan stood there in an expensive charcoal suit, looking more like he was attending a board meeting than a family dinner. At 45, he had his father's height, but none of his warmth. Beside him stood Aria Parker Allen, his wife of 15 years. At 40, Aria was strikingly beautiful, with flawless dark skin, high cheekbones, and eyes that seemed to calculate the value of everything they saw. Behind them stood Diana Parker, Aria's mother, elegant and regal in a deep burgundy dress. "Mother," Nathan said formally, leaning in for the briefest of cheek kisses. "Stephanie," Aria nodded, her smile not quite reaching her eyes. "So good to see you again," Diana added, her gaze already moving past Stephanie to assess the house. The greetings felt rehearsed, cold, nothing like the joyful reunion Stephanie had imagined. She pushed the thought away and ushered them inside, where the grandchildren immediately rushed to greet them. "Dad!" Jacob exclaimed, hugging his father tightly. Nathan's expression softened momentarily as he patted his son's back. Hey, sport, Merry Christmas. We helped Gran decorate the whole house, Emily said, her eyes seeking approval. It's very traditional, Arya remarked, her tone making it clear this wasn't a compliment. Stephanie felt a familiar pang. Traditional, old-fashioned, out of touch. These were the words that had been increasingly thrown her way at board meetings and family gatherings alike, as if her decades of experience were suddenly a liability rather than an asset. Can I get anyone a drink? Stephanie offered, determined to maintain the holiday spirit. Richard's special eggnog recipe. Just sparkling water for me, Arya said quickly. I'll take a scotch. Neat, Nathan replied, his eyes already drifting toward his father's study. I'd love some of Richard's famous eggnog, Diana said sweetly, though something in her tone made Stephanie wonder if it was a genuine request. The next hour passed in a blur of small talk and growing tension. Nathan spent most of it on his phone, stepping away for important calls that somehow couldn't wait until after Christmas. Arya circled the living room like a curator evaluating an outdated exhibit, occasionally touching a piece of furniture or artwork with a contemplative frown. Diana engaged in conversation with practiced charm, asking questions about the ranch's upkeep that felt more like a property assessment than genuine interest. Only the grandchildren seemed immune to the strained atmosphere, excitedly showing off the decorations they'd helped with and sharing stories about school. Stephanie focused on them, drawing strength from their uncomplicated love. Dinner is served, announced Margaret, the housekeeper who had been with the family for 30 years. As they moved toward the dining room, Stephanie caught a glimpse of Nathan and Arya in hushed conversation near the fireplace. Arya's hand was on Nathan's arm, her fingers digging slightly into his sleeve as she whispered something urgent in his ear. Nathan's face hardened, his jaw set in a way that reminded Stephanie painfully of Richard in his rare moments of anger. Is everything all right? She asked, approaching them. They separated immediately, Arya's hand dropping to her side. Fine. Mother, just discussing some business, Nathan replied dismissively. On Christmas Eve, Stephanie raised an eyebrow. The market doesn't take holidays. Stephanie, Arya said with a thin smile. Neither does Reed Construction. Before Stephanie could respond, Diana appeared at her side. Shall we move to the dining room? Everything smells absolutely divine. The dining room was Stephanie's pride and joy, especially during the holidays. The long mahogany table gleamed under soft lighting, decorated with pine boughs, red candles, and the Reed family's heirloom silver. The formal place settings sparkled, with name cards carefully positioned at each seat. As they entered, Stephanie noticed Diana walking directly to the head of the table, Richard's former place, and now hers, without hesitation. Diana placed her evening bag on the table beside the chair and sat down, crossing her legs with serene confidence. The staff exchanged nervous glances. Even Jacob seemed to sense the shift in atmosphere, his cheerful chatter fading into silence. Gran, Emily whispered, her eyes darting between Stephanie and Diana. Stephanie took a steadying breath and approached her usual seat. I think there's been a misunderstanding. Diana, that's my seat. Diana looked up, her expression one of polite confusion. Oh, I assumed as the eldest woman present, I would be seated at the head. The head of the table in this house belongs to the head of the Reed family, Stephanie explained gently but firmly. That would be me. An uncomfortable silence fell over the room. Stephanie could feel Nathan and Arya watching intently, as if this small interaction was far more significant than it appeared. Mother, Nathan said, stepping forward. His face was pale, his jaw tight. Actually, there's something we need to discuss. Stephanie looked at her son, suddenly aware that this moment had been planned. Yes, Nathan. Diana will be sitting there tonight, he stated flatly. Stephanie blinked, certain she had misheard. What are you talking about? Diana's seat is right there. She gestured to the place card with Diana's name, set to the right of the head chair. Things are changing, Nathan continued, his voice growing stronger, bolstered by Arya's encouraging nod from behind him. Diana is the senior woman here now. Senior woman, Stephanie repeated, bewildered. Nathan, this is my home, the home your father and I built. It's time for new leadership, he replied coldly. In the family and in the company. The words hit Stephanie like physical blows. She looked around the table at the shocked faces of the staff, at Emily's wide eyes and Jacob's confused expression. Then she looked at Diana, who offered a small, sympathetic smile that didn't reach her eyes. "This is ridiculous," Stephanie said, fighting to keep her voice steady. "Now, if you don't mind, Diana, that's my chair. I've been sitting there for 40 years, since before Nathan was born." "That's exactly the problem," Nathan snapped, his frustration boiling over. "You're stuck in the past. Mother, Dad's been gone for 2 years. It's my house now, my company. It is not your house until I am dead," Stephanie replied, her voice dropping to a whisper filled with cold fury. That was when it happened. Nathan didn't argue further. He lost all patience. He placed his hand flat on Stephanie's shoulder and pushed. It wasn't a gentle nudge. It was a hard, deliberate shove, fueled by years of resentment Stephanie never knew existed. For a 72-year-old woman, it doesn't take much to lose balance. She stumbled backward, her heel catching on the rug. Time seemed to slow down. She saw Emily's horrified expression across the table. She saw Jacob's mouth open in a silent scream. She saw Arya's lips curl into a faint, triumphant smirk. Then impact. Her hip struck the marble floor with a sickening thud. The sharp, blinding pain was immediate, but the emotional shock was worse. Her wine glass, which she'd still been holding, flew from her hand and shattered against the floor, the sound as sharp and violent as a gunshot. A deathly silence fell over the room, broken only by Jacob's anguished cry, "Gran!" He jumped from his chair to run to her, but Stephanie's eyes were locked on something else, a small blinking red light. Emily, her sensitive, thoughtful Emily, had been holding her new phone, intending to capture a video of their happy Christmas dinner. Her hand was shaking, but the lens was pointed directly at the scene. It had recorded everything. The shift in Nathan's behavior hadn't happened overnight. Looking back, Stephanie could see the signs were there, like hairline cracks in a foundation, slowly spreading beneath the surface. Nathan had always stood in his father's shadow. Richard Reed had been a force of nature, charismatic, bold, visionary. He built skyscrapers and transformed city skylines with the same ease that other men might build a garden shed. His handshake sealed million-dollar deals, and his word was considered stronger than any written contract. Their son had inherited Richard's height and his sharp features, but not his natural confidence or business instincts. Where Richard made decisions based on gut feeling and experience, Nathan relied on spreadsheets and consultants. Where Richard connected with people easily, Nathan remained awkward and formal, even after decades in the business. "He's more academic," Richard would say, trying to frame it positively. "He sees things differently." Stephanie had always defended Nathan fiercely. "He's brilliant in his own way," she would insist. "Not everyone has to be a force of nature like you." She had been Nathan's champion throughout his childhood and early career, advocating for him when Richard grew impatient, celebrating his quieter achievements when they went unnoticed by his larger-than-life father. She had believed, truly believed, that their bond was unbreakable. Perhaps that's why the changes after Richard's death blindsided her so completely. The first real warning came 6 months after the funeral, during a heated board meeting about the company's charitable giving. Reed Construction had always maintained a generous philanthropy program, supporting arts education, affordable housing initiatives, and community development. "These programs were Dad's pet projects," Nathan had said dismissively, pointing to a PowerPoint slide showing the costs. "They're eating into our bottom line without providing tangible returns." "Those programs are part of our corporate identity," Stephanie had countered, shocked by his clinical assessment. "They're how we give back to the communities where we build." "Their outdated sentimentality," Arya had interjected. As Nathan's wife, she had no official role at Reed Construction, but she'd begun attending board meetings as an observer, a development Stephanie had questioned but ultimately accepted to keep peace. "In today's market, corporate giving needs to align with strategic objectives," Arya continued, sounding like she was reading from a business school textbook. "We need programs that generate positive PR while providing tax advantages." Stephanie had looked around the boardroom at the faces of people who had worked alongside Richard for decades. They avoided her eyes. suddenly fascinated by their notepads or tablets. Richard believed that success carried responsibility, she said quietly. That we build more than just buildings. We build communities. And that philosophy served its purpose in its time, Nathan replied smoothly. But times change, Mother. We need to adapt or be left behind. The board voted 7-5 to restructure the philanthropy program, redirecting funds to higher visibility partnerships that Arya would help coordinate. It was the first defeat of many. Over the following months, Stephanie watched as Nathan, guided by Arya's whispered counsel, systematically dismantled Richard's legacy. Long-standing employees were pushed into early retirement, replaced by sleek young MBAs from Arya's network. Traditional clients were sidelined in favor of flashier, higher-profile projects. The company's warm, family-oriented culture transformed into something colder, more cutthroat. Through it all, Stephanie tried to maintain the peace, to find a middle ground between honoring Richard's vision and allowing Nathan to establish his own leadership. She smiled through uncomfortable board meetings, hosted dinners for Nathan's new executive team, and kept her concerns private. He's finding his way, she would tell herself. Richard struggled at first, too, but unlike Richard, who had sought Stephanie's counsel and valued her financial acumen, Nathan increasingly shut her out. Their weekly lunch meetings became monthly, then quarterly. He stopped sharing financial reports, citing streamlined information protocols. When she asked direct questions about company decisions, she received vague, patronizing answers. Don't worry about the technical details, Mother. The business side is under control. The business side, as if she hadn't been the one balancing the books and securing financing when Reed Construction was operating out of their garage. As if she hadn't mortgaged her own inheritance to keep the company afloat during the recession of the early 1990s. The final insult came 3 months before Christmas, when Nathan announced the company headquarters would be moving from the Reed building, the downtown landmark Richard had designed and built as their flagship, to a sleek new innovation campus in the suburbs. The Reed building is a dinosaur, Arya had explained at a family dinner, while Diana nodded approvingly. The new campus will reflect Nathan's forward-thinking leadership. Stephanie had said nothing, but later that night, alone in the bedroom she had once shared with Richard, she wept for the first time since his funeral. The week before Christmas, while Stephanie's heart was full of nothing but love for her family, the plot against her was already in motion. Diana Parker had arrived in Dallas 3 days early, ostensibly to help with holiday preparations, but spending most of her time on her phone in hushed conversations. Arya and Nathan had been suspiciously busy, canceling their usual pre-Christmas dinner with Stephanie to attend an important business dinner downtown. Stephanie could picture the scene now, as if she'd been a fly on the wall in an expensive restaurant with sharp angles and hushed, self-important tones, the kind of place where deals were made. A cold and sterile environment for a cold and sterile conversation. The three of them would have ordered a bottle of wine that cost more than most people's weekly groceries. Diana would have guided the conversation with the practiced skill of a master puppeteer. "Nathan, darling," she would have said, her voice smooth as silk. "You know how much I admire Stephanie. She's one of the strongest women I've ever known." She would have paused, letting the compliment land, disarming him. But the world of construction, of business, it isn't the same one she and Richard conquered. It's faster now, more ruthless. Her ideas, while well-intentioned, are outdated. Nathan would have shifted uncomfortably in his seat. A part of him, the boy Stephanie raised, would have wanted to defend her. Mother knows what she's doing. She helped Dad build Reed Construction from the ground up. That's when Arya would have jumped in, playing her part perfectly. "Of course she did, honey," she'd say, placing her hand on his. "No one is denying that, but that was then. This is now. We just had a board meeting where she tried to earmark $2 million for a new local arts program. $2 million. We have competitors trying to undercut us on the Westfield contract, and she wants to fund a theater," Diana would have asked, eyes wide with calculated disbelief. "It's not about the money, Nathan," Diana would have continued, nodding gravely. "It's about focus. Your mother still sees the company as a family project, a way to do good in the community. That's lovely. but it's a liability in today's market. You have your father's head for business, but you're being held back. His entire life, Nathan had struggled under the weight of his father's legacy. Diana's words were designed to hit him where it hurt most: his insecurity, his desperate need to prove that he was his own man. She needs to understand that her time of running things is over, Diana would have said, her voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. It's your time now. You have to be strong. Nathan, not for you, but for your own family, for Arya, for your children's future. She's right, Arya would chime in, her eyes hard. We need to have complete control. Nathan, full authority to make the tough decisions without having to run them by her for approval. It's time we took what is rightfully ours. The hesitation in Nathan's eyes would have been painful to witness. There must have been a moment, a flicker of a second, where his love and loyalty to his mother fought against the poison they were pouring into his ears. But it wasn't a fair fight. On one side was his mother, who he saw as a relic of the past. On the other were these two women stroking his ego, promising him the power and respect he craved. A silent agreement had been forged in the dim light of that soulless restaurant. The ambush was set, and Stephanie, miles away, was happily preparing for Christmas, completely oblivious to the fact that her own son had just agreed to push her out of her home, her company, and her life. The cold of the marble floor seeped through Stephanie's clothes, chilling her to the bone. But the ice in her veins had nothing to do with temperature. It was shock, pure and absolute, freezing her in place as she stared up at the stranger wearing her son's face. "Mother!" Emily cried, rushing to Stephanie's side. Nathan stood motionless, his hand still extended from the push, a look of grim resolve hardening his features. Behind him, Arya's momentary smile of triumph quickly transformed into a mask of concern. "Oh my goodness," she gasped theatrically. "Stephanie, are you all right?" Diana remained seated, her expression unreadable, hands folded neatly on the table. Jacob reached his grandmother first, his young face contorted with confusion and fear. "Gran, are you hurt?" Stephanie couldn't speak. The physical pain from the fall was nothing compared to the searing betrayal that burned through her chest. She looked into Nathan's eyes, searching for some sign of remorse, some flicker of the son she had raised. She found nothing but cold determination. "Nathan Allen." The sharp voice belonged to Margaret, the housekeeper, who rushed forward with a kitchen towel for the spilled wine. "What on earth has gotten into you?" Nathan seemed to come back to himself slightly, blinking as if awakening from a trance. He glanced at Arya, who gave him a barely perceptible nod. "Mother needs to understand that things have changed," he said, his voice mechanical. "This house, this company, they aren't hers to control anymore." "This is my house," Stephanie said, finding her voice at last. It came out steady and clear, despite the trembling in her limbs. "The house your father and I built, that we raised you in. It's part of Reed family assets," Arya interjected smoothly. "Assets that Nathan now controls as CEO." "You know that's not true," Stephanie said, allowing Emily and Jacob to help her to her feet. She winced at the pain in her hip but stood as straight as she could. "The ranch was always separate from the company. Richard put it in my name alone 30 years ago. Legal technicalities can be addressed." Diana spoke for the first time, her voice reasonable and calm, as if discussing a minor scheduling conflict rather than the theft of someone's home. "The point is, Stephanie, it's time for you to step aside gracefully, for the good of the family." "The good of the family?" Stephanie repeated, incredulous. "You mean for your good? Don't think I don't see what's happening here." The room fell silent again. The staff had backed against the walls, wide-eyed witnesses to the implosion of the Reed family. Only Emily still held her phone, its camera still recording, capturing every word, every expression. "Children, perhaps you should leave the room," Arya suggested, suddenly noticing the device in her daughter's hand. "Emily, put your phone away. This is a private family matter." Emily's hand tightened around her phone. "I'm staying with Gran," she said, her voice small but determined. "Me too," Jacob added, pressing closer to Stephanie's side. Nathan's face darkened. "Emily, Jacob, go to your rooms, now." "No." The word came from Stephanie, quiet but firm. They stay. I want witnesses to what's happening here. I want them to see exactly what their father has become. This is ridiculous, Nathan snapped. You're being dramatic, Mother. This is a simple transition of power. Nothing more. Simple, Stephanie laughed. A harsh, bitter sound. There's nothing simple about a son betraying his mother on Christmas Eve, about a man pushing an elderly woman to the ground because she wouldn't give up her seat at her own dinner table. You fell, Arya said quickly. Nathan was just trying to guide you away from the chair. We all saw what happened, Margaret interjected, her loyalty to Stephanie overriding her usual discretion. And some of us have it on video, Emily added softly, holding up her phone. Nathan's eyes widened slightly, the first sign of uncertainty crossing his face. He looked at Arya, whose composed expression had slipped momentarily, revealing a flash of alarm. Give me that phone, Emily, Arya demanded, stepping toward her daughter. Emily backed away, moving closer to her grandmother. No, Mom. The tension in the room was unbearable. Stephanie could feel herself starting to shake, the adrenaline wearing off, leaving only pain and exhaustion in its wake. I think we're done here, she said quietly. Nathan, Arya, Diana, I'd like you to leave my house now. Mother, Nathan began, but Stephanie cut him off. Now, she repeated, her voice like steel. Or shall I call the police and report an assault? Diana stood smoothly, gathering her handbag. Come, Nathan, Arya, this conversation can continue when tempers have cooled. She turned to Stephanie with a practiced smile. Stephanie, I hope you'll reconsider your position. Changes are coming, whether you accept them gracefully or not. Get out. Each word was a bullet. Nathan hesitated, something like shame finally crossing his features, but Arya took his arm firmly, steering him toward the door. We'll discuss this tomorrow. Stephanie, when you're thinking more clearly. The three of them left the dining room, their footsteps echoing on the hardwood floors of the entrance hall. Moments later, the heavy front door closed with a definitive thud. Stephanie stood motionless until she heard their car pull away. Only then did she allow herself to sag slightly, the pain in her hip becoming impossible to ignore. Mrs. Reed, you need to sit down, Margaret urged, pulling out a chair. Should I call a doctor? Stephanie shook her head. Not yet. She looked at her grandchildren, both still pale with shock. Emily, Jacob, are you all right? They nodded wordlessly, still processing what they had witnessed. Emily, Stephanie said gently, that video you took. I got it all. Gran, Emily whispered, her voice shaking. Everything. Dad pushing you. Mom smiling when you fell. Stephanie closed her eyes briefly. I need you to send that to me, sweetheart. And then I need you both to go upstairs. Pack overnight bags. You're not going back to their house tonight. Can we stay with you? Jacob asked, his young face etched with worry. Of course you can, Stephanie assured him, reaching out to squeeze his hand. For as long as you need to. After the children went upstairs, accompanied by Margaret, Stephanie lowered herself carefully into a chair at the abandoned dinner table. The candles still burned, casting flickering shadows across the untouched feast. Richard's portrait hung on the wall opposite, his confident smile now seeming sad, almost apologetic. You should have warned me, Richard, she whispered to the empty room. You should have told me what our son was becoming. Her phone buzzed with an incoming message, the video from Emily. Stephanie watched it once, her hand pressed to her mouth to stifle a sob. It was worse than she remembered. The cold calculation in Nathan's eyes as he approached her, the deliberate force behind his push, Arya's unmistakable smile of triumph as Stephanie hit the floor, with hands that trembled only slightly. Stephanie opened her contacts and found the number she needed. Charles Bennett had been Richard's lawyer and best friend for over 40 years. If anyone would know what to do, it would be Charles. The phone rang 3 times before he answered, his voice warm with holiday cheer. Stephanie. Merry Christmas, my dear. How's the family gathering going? Stephanie took a deep breath, her decision made. When she spoke, her voice was not the voice of a weeping, broken woman, It was layered with steel. It was the voice of a queen preparing for war. "Charles," she said, "I need to see you first thing tomorrow morning. It's about Nathan. And I'm going to need everything Richard left to protect me." The drive from the Reed Ranch to Charles Bennett's downtown office seemed interminable. Every stoplight lasted an eternity. Every intersection a point of frustration as Stephanie's mind raced with the events of the previous night. Her hip throbbed persistently, a physical reminder of her son's betrayal. But she refused to acknowledge the pain. There would be time for weakness later. Today required strength. Charles Bennett's law office occupied the top floor of a distinguished building he'd owned for 30 years. Unlike the sleek glass towers that now dominated Dallas's skyline, Bennett and Associates maintained an old-world dignity: dark mahogany paneling, Persian rugs over hardwood floors, and walls lined with leather-bound law books. It smelled faintly of pipe tobacco and fine bourbon, scents that instantly transported Stephanie back to evenings spent here with Richard, planning their future. Charles met her at the elevator, his familiar face etched with concern. At 74, he was still sharp as a tack, with intelligent eyes that had seen it all during his 5 decades of legal practice. He took one look at Stephanie's carefully composed expression and the slight limp she couldn't quite hide, and his concern deepened. "My God, Stephanie," he said quietly, ushering her into his private office. "What happened?" Without a word, Stephanie pulled out her phone and played Emily's video. Charles watched in silence, his knuckles whitening as he gripped the edge of his mahogany desk. When the video ended, the only sound in the room was the antique clock ticking on the wall. "He pushed you," Charles said finally, his voice thick with disbelief. "Your own son pushed you to the floor." "In front of his children," Stephanie added, her composure finally cracking. "On Christmas Eve, because I wouldn't give up my seat at the head of the table to Diana Parker." Charles poured 2 fingers of bourbon into crystal tumblers and handed one to Stephanie. She took it gratefully, allowing the fiery liquid to burn away some of the ice that had settled in her chest. "Richard saw this coming," Charles said after a long moment, his eyes distant. "He prayed it would never happen. But he knew it might. He knew Nathan's weakness." Stephanie looked up sharply. "What are you talking about?" Instead of answering, Charles rose and walked to the wall safe hidden behind a landscape painting. He dialed the combination with practiced ease and extracted a thick, cream-colored envelope sealed with the Reed family crest in dark red wax. "Richard added a special provision to his final directives," Charles explained, placing the envelope on the desk between them. "Separate from the main will. He called it his poison pill clause." Stephanie's hand trembled slightly as she reached for the envelope. "A poison pill, that's a corporate term, a defense against a hostile takeover." "Precisely," Charles said, his eyes meeting hers. "And Richard saw exactly what was coming, a hostile takeover of his family." Charles leaned forward, his voice low and serious. "Richard noticed changes in Nathan after he married Aria. The increasing influence of Diana Parker concerned him deeply. He said Nathan had always been eager for approval, too easily swayed by stronger personalities. Richard feared that one day, those weaknesses might be exploited. So he created a fail-safe," Stephanie whispered, staring at the sealed envelope. "The clause states that if Nathan, as CEO and majority shareholder, subjects you to provable and irrefutable public humiliation, you are granted the immediate right to purchase his entire controlling stake in Reed Construction, all of it, for the symbolic sum of $1 United States dollar." Stephanie stared at Charles, the air leaving her lungs, the audacity of it, the strategic brilliance, was pure Richard. But the implication was devastating. "He wanted me to bankrupt our son," she asked, her voice barely audible. "No," Charles corrected gently. "He wanted to give you a choice. He wanted to ensure that you would never be at the mercy of Nathan's weakness or outside influence. He was giving you a loaded gun, Stephanie, and trusting that you would only ever use it if they backed you into a corner so tight you had no other way out." A loaded gun. The weight of it settled on her shoulders, heavy and cold. For a moment, Stephanie recoiled from it. To pull that trigger would be to declare total war, to destroy what was left of her family. It was unthinkable. It's an explosive legal maneuver, Charles continued, and Nathan would fight it tooth and nail. The entire case would hinge on one thing, the proof. The humiliation can't be just your word against his. It has to be absolute, undeniable, something a judge could look at and have no doubt. He paused. Do you have that kind of proof? Stephanie? The image flashed behind her eyes, clear as a photograph, Emily's phone recording everything. Nathan's face twisted in anger, his hand on her shoulder, her body falling, the shattered glass, Arya's triumphant smirk. Yes, she said simply. I have proof, Charles nodded, the attorney in him already calculating. The video would qualify. It's damning evidence of deliberate humiliation from a son to his mother, in front of family and staff. He broke the seal on the envelope and spread the documents before her. The legal language was dense, but the intent was crystal clear if triggered. The clause would force Nathan to sell his 51% controlling interest in Reed Construction to Stephanie for $1. There's one significant problem, Charles added, his expression grave. While this gives you legal ownership, it doesn't provide operating capital. Reed Construction operates with substantial debt, like most development companies, without access to credit lines and cash reserves. You could own the company on paper but be unable to run it. Nathan would make sure the banks turn me down, Stephanie realized, seeing the flaw in Richard's plan. He'd poison every well in Dallas before letting me take control. Exactly, Charles confirmed. And that's exactly what he's done. I made some calls this morning. Every major lender in the state has been warned that Reed Construction is experiencing leadership instability. They've been told that any loans to you would be high risk. Stephanie felt a cold fury building inside her, not just at Nathan's betrayal, but at his thoroughness. He had planned this meticulously, closing off every avenue of resistance before making his move. There has to be a way, she said, more to herself than to Charles. Richard wouldn't have created this option without ensuring it could work. Charles hesitated, then opened a drawer and pulled out a folder of financial documents. I took the liberty of reviewing Reed Construction's recent filings. Stephanie, I'm concerned about what I found. He spread the papers on the desk, pointing to highlighted sections. These are capital allocations from the past 18 months, large sums transferred to subsidiary companies I don't recognize. Consulting fees to firms that didn't exist 3 years ago. Significant bonuses to new executives. Stephanie studied the documents, her financial acumen immediately spotting the patterns. He's been draining the company, she said, stunned. Creating shell corporations, moving assets, preparing for this moment. It appears so, Charles agreed grimly. Nathan's been systematically redirecting Reed Construction's resources, possibly into entities he controls personally. It's technically legal as CEO, but ethically questionable at best. And Diana and Arya have been helping him, Stephanie added, pieces falling into place. Those business trips to the Caymans last summer. The new investment advisors Diana recommended. She stood suddenly, pacing the office despite the pain in her hip. This isn't just about pushing me aside. They're gutting Richard's company from the inside, stripping it for parts. The realization was like a physical blow. This wasn't a son asserting independence. This was calculated corporate theft disguised as a family dispute. The targets weren't just Stephanie's position and home, but the very legacy Richard had built. We need to move quickly, Charles advised. If we invoke the poison pill clause, we need capital immediately to stabilize the company. The banks won't help, Stephanie said, thinking aloud. Our regular investors are all connected to Nathan now. Who would have both the resources and the courage to defy him? The answer came to her like a thunderbolt, shocking, impossible, and yet perfect in its symmetry. Arthur Vance, she said, turning to Charles with newfound determination. Charles blanched. Arthur Vance Richards' greatest rival, the man spent 30 years trying to destroy Reed Construction. Exactly, Stephanie replied, a plan forming rapidly. He's the only person in Texas with enough money and enough spite to help me just to see Nathan fall. Stephanie, think about what you're saying, Charles cautioned. Arthur Vance is a shark. If you invite him into Reed Construction, he'll never leave. Richard would turn in his grave. Richard isn't here, Stephanie said sharply, the words painful but necessary. He left me to fight this battle alone, with a weapon that's useless without ammunition, so I'll find my own ammunition. She gathered her purse. Decision made. Set up a meeting with Vance, today if possible. Charles looked as though he wanted to argue further, but something in Stephanie's expression stopped him. Instead, he nodded slowly. I'll make the call. As Stephanie turned to leave, Charles added quietly, What about the grandchildren, Emily and Jacob? Stephanie paused at the door. They're staying with me at the ranch. Nathan and Aria tried to collect them this morning, but the children refused to go. Emily told her father she wouldn't return until he apologized to me. A small, sad smile crossed her face. She's Richard's granddaughter, through and through, stronger than all of us. By noon, Stephanie had visited 3 banks. By 3 o'clock, that number had risen to 5. The responses varied in their delivery, but were identical in substance. No loans, no credit lines, no financial support of any kind. At Texas Capital Bank, where the Reed family had done business for 40 years, the rejection stung most sharply. Marcus Doyle, the bank's president and a man who had attended Richard's funeral, couldn't quite meet Stephanie's eyes as he delivered the practiced speech. We have concerns about leadership instability at Reed Construction, he explained, fingers tapping nervously on the conference table. Given the current climate, we're not in a position to extend additional credit at this time. Leadership instability, Stephanie repeated flatly. You mean my son has gotten to you? Marcus sighed, finally looking up. Stephanie, you know I respect you enormously. But Nathan is the CEO. He's made it clear that any financing provided to you would be considered hostile to the company's interests. And if I told you I'm invoking a clause in Richard's will that gives me the right to purchase Nathan's controlling stake, I'd say that sounds like exactly the kind of family dispute that makes banks nervous, Marcus replied, his expression sympathetic but firm. Come back when it's settled, and we can discuss financing then. The pattern repeated at every institution. Some loan officers were apologetic, others coldly professional, but the outcome never changed. By late afternoon, exhausted and increasingly desperate, Stephanie found herself sitting in her car in the parking garage of the last bank on her list, staring at her phone. The screen showed a text from Emily. Are you okay? Grand call when you can? Sweet, perceptive Emily. Stephanie smiled despite herself and typed a quick reassurance before turning her attention to the other notification. A message from Charles Bennett with an address and a time. Arthur Vance, 5:00 p.m. today. His residence. Are you certain? Stephanie checked her watch. 4:15 p.m. Without allowing herself time for second thoughts, she entered the address into her navigation system and pulled out of the garage. Arthur Vance's mansion in Highland Park stood in stark contrast to the warm, traditional elegance of Reed Ranch, where the Reed home embraced Texas heritage with its native stone, wood beams, and comfortable furnishings. Vance's residence was aggressively modern, a gleaming structure of glass, steel, and sharp angles that seemed designed to intimidate rather than welcome. As she drove through the imposing gates, Stephanie felt a moment of doubt. Arthur Vance had been Richard's nemesis for decades. Their rivalry had been legendary in Dallas business circles, 2 titans of construction competing for the same contracts, the same skyline, the same legacy. Richard had always won through superior quality and relationships. Vance had countered with cutthroat pricing and political connections. The last time Stephanie had seen Arthur Vance was at Richard's funeral, where he'd stood at the back of the church, said nothing, and left before the service ended. His presence had been neither tribute nor taunt, simply acknowledgement that an era had ended. And now she was about to ask him for help. A stone-faced assistant met her at the door and led her through a minimalist foyer into a vast living room dominated by floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking downtown Dallas. The city Richard and Arthur had spent their lives transforming spread before her like a glittering chessboard. Arthur Vance entered silently, a tall, lean figure with sharp features and calculating blue eyes. At 75, he moved with the deliberate precision of a man who wasted nothing, not words, not energy, not opportunities. Stephanie Reed, he said, his voice as dry as desert air. To what do I owe this unprecedented visit? Stephanie met his gaze directly. I need your help. Arthur, a ghost of a smile touched his lips. Those are 5 words I never expected to hear from a Reed. Believe me, they're 5 words I never expected to say. Arthur gestured to a sleek white leather sofa. Please sit. Would you like a drink? No, Stephanie replied, remaining standing. I'd prefer to state my business clearly, without social niceties that neither of us believes in. This earned her a genuine look of surprise, quickly replaced by something that might have been respect. Very well. State your business, Mrs. Reed. Stephanie took a deep breath. My son Nathan has betrayed me. He's attempting to force me out of my home and has been systematically draining Reed Construction of assets through shell companies and fraudulent consulting arrangements. She watched Arthur's face carefully, searching for any hint of prior knowledge or involvement, but his expression remained neutral. I have a legal mechanism to reclaim controlling interest in the company for the symbolic sum of $1, she continued. But Nathan has blacklisted me with every bank in Texas. I need capital, substantial capital, to operate the company once I take control. And you came to me, Arthur said, moving to the window to gaze out at the skyline. Your husband's greatest competitor, the man Richard Reed called a soulless corporate vampire to the Dallas Business Journal in 1997. He apologized for that remark, Stephanie noted. No, he didn't, Arthur replied, the ghost of a smile returning. But I admired his honesty. He turned to face her, hands clasped behind his back. Why me, Stephanie? Why not your regular investors, your friends in high places? Because Nathan owns them now, she answered simply. And because you're the only person in Dallas with both the resources and the nerve to defy him. Arthur laughed, a short, sharp sound. So it's my resources and my spite you're counting on. Yes, Stephanie admitted. That and your business acumen. You know Reed Construction is valuable, or would be, if it weren't being gutted from within. You've wanted a piece of it for decades. This is your opportunity. Arthur studied her with renewed interest. What exactly are you proposing? I need a line of credit large enough to stabilize Reed Construction after I invoke the poison pill clause. In exchange, I'm prepared to offer you a minority stake in the company. How minority? Stephanie had anticipated this question. She'd spent the afternoon calculating the minimum she could offer that would still be attractive enough. 30%, she said firmly. Arthur shook his head. 40%, non-negotiable. I'll provide the full line of credit you need, and I'll fund your legal battle to the bitter end. In exchange, upon your successful acquisition of your son's shares, you will sign over 40% of Reed Construction to Vance Enterprises. It was a devil's bargain. Stephanie would be giving away nearly half of the empire she and Richard had built, handing their greatest enemy a substantial stake in their legacy. But the alternative was to let it all fall into the undeserving hands of Nathan, Aria, and Diana, to let them tarnish everything Richard had stood for. She extended her hand. 40%. You have a deal. Arthur looked at her outstretched hand for a moment, then took it in his own firm, dry grip. The handshake was brief, businesslike. An unholy alliance had just been formed. I'll have the paperwork drawn up immediately, Arthur said. My attorneys will contact Charles Bennett in the morning. Stephanie nodded, suddenly exhausted now that the deal was done. Thank you, Arthur. He walked her to the door, then paused. One thing puzzles me. Stephanie, this poison pill clause of Richard's, it's brilliant, but surely he knew you'd need capital to make it work. Did he not make any provisions for that? I've been wondering the same thing, Stephanie admitted. Richard thought of everything, except this. Perhaps, Arthur suggested. He assumed that if things got this bad, you'd be willing to make deals even he couldn't imagine. As Stephanie drove away from Vance's mansion, his words echoed in her mind. Had Richard foreseen even this, that she would be desperate enough to partner with their oldest rival? Had that been part of his calculation all along? The sun was setting as she returned to Reed Ranch, casting long shadows across the property. Emily and Jacob were waiting on the porch, their young faces brightening as her car pulled up the drive. Gran, Jacob called, running to meet her. We were worried about you. Stephanie hugged him tightly, drawing strength from his uncomplicated affection. I'm fine, sweetheart. Just a long day of meetings. Emily approached more slowly, her perceptive eyes taking in Stephanie's weary expression. "Did you show the video to people who can help?" "I did," Stephanie confirmed, putting an arm around her granddaughter's shoulders. "And we're going to make things right." As they entered the house, Stephanie's phone rang, Charles Bennett calling. "I've just heard from Arthur's attorneys," he said without preamble. "Stephanie, are you absolutely certain about this 40% is an enormous concession?" "I'm certain," she replied, watching Emily and Jacob head toward the kitchen. "Whatever it costs, I have to protect what matters most." The next morning brought both clarity and complications. Stephanie awoke early, the pain in her hip a dull reminder of Christmas Eve's ugliness, but her mind was sharp, focused on the battle ahead. She made coffee and carried it out to the porch, watching the sun rise over the ranch that had been her home for 40 years. Her phone chimed with an incoming email, financial documents from Arthur Vance's team, outlining the terms of their arrangement in meticulous detail. The numbers were staggering: a credit line of $50 million immediately available upon successful invocation of the poison pill clause, in exchange for 40% of Reed Construction's shares. It was a fortune, but also a bargain. Reed Construction, even after Nathan's financial maneuvering, was worth far more. Arthur Vance knew he was getting a steal, but Stephanie had run out of options, and Arthur knew that too. A second email arrived from Charles Bennett, confirming he'd begun preparing the legal paperwork to invoke the poison pill clause. "Initial filing complete," he wrote. "Emergency board meeting called for tomorrow, 10 a.m. Be prepared for resistance." Resistance was an understatement. Nathan would fight like a cornered animal once he realized what was happening. But with Arthur Vance's resources behind her, Stephanie finally had the ammunition to fire the gun Richard had left her. She was reviewing the documents when Margaret appeared at the door. "Mrs. Reed," the housekeeper said hesitantly, "there's a news alert about Reed Construction. I thought you should see it." Stephanie followed her inside to the kitchen, where the television was tuned to a local business news channel. The anchor was mid-sentence. "Statement released this morning from Diana Parker, mother-in-law of Reed Construction CEO Nathan Allen." The statement expresses shock and concern over what Parker describes as a regrettable family incident at the Reed family Christmas gathering. The screen showed Diana's professionally photographed face alongside the text of her statement. "I am profoundly saddened and deeply disturbed by recent events within the Reed family. I was not party to, nor did I have any prior knowledge of the regrettable incident that took place on Christmas Eve. My only wish is for a swift and peaceful resolution. My primary concern at this time, as it has always been, is for the stability of Reed Construction and the preservation of the legacy of its great founder, the late Richard Reed." Stephanie stared at the screen in disbelief. She's distancing herself, throwing Nathan under the bus. The anchor continued. "This statement comes amid rumors of leadership tensions at Reed Construction, with sources suggesting a major power struggle between CEO Nathan Allen and his mother, company co-founder Stephanie Reed. Reed Construction shares fell 3% in pre-market trading on concerns about corporate stability." Margaret switched off the television, her expression grim. "That woman has some nerve. She's protecting herself," Stephanie said, mind racing. "Diana sees which way the wind is blowing. She's abandoning Nathan and Arya to save her own reputation." It was a calculated move, typical of Diana's strategic thinking. By publicly expressing concern and denying involvement, she was positioning herself as an innocent bystander, perhaps even a potential mediator in the conflict. It was a masterful piece of public relations, and it confirmed what Stephanie had suspected: Diana had never been truly committed to Nathan and Arya. They had been tools for her ambitions, useful until they weren't. Stephanie's phone rang. Charles Bennett again. "Have you seen Diana's statement?" he asked immediately. "Just now, she's cutting them loose." "Not just that," Charles said. "I've had calls from 3 board members this morning, all mentioning conversations they had with Diana yesterday. She's been reaching out to them individually, expressing concern about Nathan's emotional stability and suggesting the board might need to intervene for the company's sake." Stephanie laughed bitterly. "Let me guess. With Diana as interim chairwoman." "Exactly," Charles confirmed. "She's making a play for control, positioning herself as the steady hand in a crisis. A crisis she helped create, Stephanie noted. She's been playing a longer game than even I realized. It gets worse, Charles added. My sources tell me Diana has been quietly building relationships with key Reed construction investors for months. She's been preparing her own contingency plan all along. The pieces fell into place with devastating clarity. Diana had never intended to be merely the power behind Nathan's throne. She had been setting up her own takeover, using her daughter and son-in-law as pawns, waiting for the perfect moment to step in as the company's savior. The board meeting tomorrow just got more complicated, Stephanie said, mind already working on counter-strategies. Diana will try to convince the board that both Nathan and I are liabilities. She'll present herself as the neutral third option. What do you want to do? Stephanie thought for a moment, then made her decision. Move forward exactly as planned. Diana thinks she's the only one with a surprise. She's wrong. After ending the call, Stephanie found Emily and Jacob in the game room, attempting to maintain holiday spirits despite the tension permeating the house. Their resilience touched her heart. Gran, Emily said, looking up from a board game. Mom's been calling and texting. She says we need to come home today, that you're not well and need rest. Stephanie sat down beside them. What do you want to do? The siblings exchanged glances. Stay with you, Jacob said immediately. Dad did a terrible thing, Emily added, her young face serious beyond her years. We can't just pretend it didn't happen. Stephanie hugged them both, grateful for their loyalty but concerned about putting them in the middle of an increasingly ugly family war. I have an important meeting tomorrow, she told them. After that, things might get very complicated for a while. You may need to make difficult choices, and whatever you decide, I'll support you. Is Dad going to lose his job? Jacob asked worriedly. Stephanie chose her words carefully. Your father made choices that have consequences. But no matter what happens with the company, he'll always be your father. And he loves you both very much. Does he love you? Emily asked pointedly. The question pierced Stephanie's heart. That's complicated, sweetheart. Sometimes people can love someone and still hurt them badly. Emily nodded, seeming to accept this difficult truth. What's going to happen to Reed Construction? I'm going to make sure it remains what your grandfather built it to be, a company that builds things that last, that matters to the community, that stands for integrity. Stephanie smiled sadly. Even if that means making some difficult compromises of my own. Later that afternoon, as Stephanie was reviewing documents in Richard's study, Margaret knocked gently on the door. There's a package for you, Mrs. Reed, hand-delivered by courier. The package was small, wrapped in expensive cream-colored paper with no card or note attached. Stephanie opened it cautiously. Inside was a single item, a vintage gold fountain pen in a velvet case. She recognized it immediately. It was the pen Richard had used to sign his first major contract, a talisman he had carried to every important negotiation throughout his career. He had lost it shortly before his death, a small tragedy in the midst of his final illness. There was no note, but there didn't need to be. Only one person could have sent it. The message was clear. Arthur Vance had possessed one of Richard Reed's most cherished possessions all along, keeping it as a trophy. Now he was returning it, not out of sentiment or regret, but as a symbol. Tomorrow, Stephanie would use her husband's pen to sign away part of his legacy to his greatest rival. It was Arthur's way of marking his victory, of reminding her of exactly what their deal meant. But as Stephanie held the familiar weight of the pen, testing its balance in her palm, she felt something unexpected, resolve, not regret. She placed the pen carefully on Richard's desk, next to the documents prepared for tomorrow's board meeting. It would indeed be used to sign those papers, but not as a symbol of defeat. Rather, as a reminder that Richard had always taught her that sometimes you had to lose a battle to win a war. The battle for Reed Construction had evolved from a simple family power struggle into a three-way chess match between Stephanie, Nathan, and Diana. Each had their own resources, their own strategies, their own vision for the future of the company. Tomorrow would determine which vision prevailed. Stephanie picked up her phone and sent a text to Emily. Could you bring me the video from Christmas Eve? I need to make sure it's ready for tomorrow. The stage was set. The pieces were in motion. and Stephanie Reed, after decades of working quietly behind the scenes, was about to step into the spotlight and fight for everything that mattered. The Reed Construction boardroom occupied the entire top floor of the Reed Building in downtown Dallas. Floor-to-ceiling windows offered a panoramic view of the skyline, much of which had been shaped by the company over 4 decades. The massive mahogany table, polished to a mirror shine, dominated the center of the room. It had been Richard's pride, carved from a single tree and commissioned when the company completed its first skyscraper. For 30 years, Stephanie had sat at Richard's right hand during board meetings. Today, she stood in the hallway outside, gathering her strength for what would likely be the most difficult confrontation of her life. "Are you ready?" Charles Bennett asked quietly, checking his watch. Beside him stood Arthur Vance, immaculate in a charcoal suit, his expression betraying nothing but cool professional interest. Behind them waited Arthur's legal team, 3 sharp-eyed attorneys who moved with the practiced coordination of a well-trained military unit. Stephanie nodded, adjusting her navy blue blazer. "Yes." "Remember," Charles advised, "Nathan will try to discredit you emotionally. Diana will position herself as the reasonable alternative. Don't engage with either strategy. Stay focused on the facts and the legal framework." "I know," Stephanie replied calmly. "My people will handle the financial aspects if questioned," Arthur added. "The credit lines are in place. Everything is ready." Stephanie's hand went to her jacket pocket, where Emily's phone rested, loaded with the video evidence that would decide everything. In her other pocket was Richard's gold fountain pen. At precisely 10 a.m., the double doors to the boardroom swung open. The scene inside was exactly as Stephanie had anticipated. Nathan sat at the head of the table, Richard's seat, her seat, looking every inch the powerful executive in control. Beside him, Arya maintained an expression of concerned sympathy that didn't reach her eyes. The board members, 12 men and women representing major investors and company interests, were arranged along both sides of the table. And at the far end, as if deliberately positioning herself as far from Nathan as possible, sat Diana Parker in an elegant gray suit, the very picture of dignified concern. The room fell silent as Stephanie entered, followed by Charles, Arthur, and the legal team. Nathan's confident expression faltered momentarily at the sight of Arthur Vance, while several board members exchanged surprised glances. "Mother," Nathan began, his voice carrying a practiced mix of authority and concern, "this emergency meeting is highly irregular. I hope you're feeling better after your unfortunate fall." The euphemism hung in the air, its inadequacy almost laughable. "I'm feeling quite well, thank you," Stephanie replied evenly, remaining standing rather than taking a seat. "Though I believe assault would be a more accurate description than fall." Murmurs rippled around the table. One of the older board members, James Harrington, who had known Richard for decades, looked particularly troubled. "And I see you've brought Arthur Vance," Nathan continued, his tone hardening. "An interesting choice of companion, considering his historical relationship with this company." "Mr. Vance is here as my financial advisor," Stephanie stated. "As you'll soon understand why." Charles stepped forward. "Ladies and gentlemen of the board, we're here to address a serious legal matter concerning the leadership of Reed Construction." He distributed folders to each board member. "These documents outline a special provision in Richard Reed's will, specifically Clause 12B, which has now been activated." Nathan's face darkened. "This is ridiculous. Whatever obscure clause you've dug up can't override established corporate governance." "I believe you'll find it can," Charles replied calmly. "The provision is linked directly to your shares, Nathan, which you inherited from your father. Those shares came with conditions." "What conditions?" asked Victoria Chen, one of the newer board members. "Simply put," Charles explained, Richard Reed included a poison pill provision stating that if Nathan Allen, as CEO and majority shareholder, subjects Stephanie Reed to provable and irrefutable public humiliation, Mrs. Reed is granted the immediate right to purchase his controlling stake in Reed Construction for the symbolic sum of $1. The boardroom erupted in confused conversation. Diana's serene mask slipped momentarily, revealing a flash of alarm before she composed herself. "This is absurd," Nathan declared, standing abruptly. Mother and I had a disagreement on Christmas Eve. She lost her balance. To frame this as some kind of triggering event for a corporate takeover is preposterous. I agree, Arya added quickly. This sounds like an emotional response to a family misunderstanding. Stephanie finally spoke, her voice cutting through the noise. This was not a misunderstanding. It was a calculated act of humiliation, part of a coordinated effort to force me out of my home and company. She turned to Charles. I believe the board should see the evidence. Charles nodded and moved to the large screen at the front of the room. With your permission, I'd like to show a video taken on Christmas Eve at the Reed family home. Before Nathan could object, Charles connected Emily's phone to the display system. The screen flickered to life, showing the Reed dining room in all its holiday splendor, the gleaming table, the candlelight, the festive decorations. Then came the confrontation. Every person in that room heard Nathan's cold, dismissive words. That seat. Diana will be sitting there tonight. They heard Stephanie's confused reply, her attempt to laugh it off. They heard him snap back, his voice rising with anger. It represents the past. You're stuck in the past. Mother, it's my house now. Nathan's face drained of color as he was forced to listen to his own cruel words echo through the boardroom. Arya sat frozen beside him, her knuckles white where she gripped the edge of the table. Across the room, Diana's serene mask had fully cracked, replaced by a look of cold, furious calculation. Then came the moment of truth. Every person in that room saw Nathan place his hand on Stephanie's shoulder. They saw him push her. They saw Stephanie, their founder's wife, a 72-year-old woman, stumble and fall hard on the marble floor. The collective gasp in the boardroom was audible. James Harrington muttered, "Good God," under his breath. Victoria Chen's hand flew to her mouth in shock. But the video wasn't done. The sound of Stephanie's wineglass shattering on the floor was like a gunshot in the tomb-like silence of the room. And then the camera, in its shaky, amateur horror, caught the final damning detail. Arya's triumphant smirk. Charles clicked the remote, and the screen went black. No one spoke. No one moved. All eyes were on Nathan, who sat slumped in his chair, his face ashen, the picture of a man who had just witnessed his own public execution. Stephanie let the silence hang for a long, heavy moment. She let them all absorb what they had witnessed. Then she rose slowly from her chair and approached her son. From her pocket, she withdrew a single crisp $1 bill and placed it on the table directly in front of him. According to Clause 12b, she said, her voice carrying clearly in the silent room, I am exercising my right to purchase your controlling interest in Reed Construction, effective immediately. Nathan stared at the dollar bill, unable to speak or meet his mother's eyes. This is outrageous, Arya finally sputtered, breaking the silence. The company can't function without Nathan. The financing is already arranged, Arthur Vance interjected smoothly, speaking for the first time. Reed Construction will have immediate access to all necessary operating capital. Several board members turned to look at Vance with new understanding. Suddenly grasping his presence, Diana Parker, sensing the tide turning irrevocably, made her move. While this is deeply troubling, we must consider the stability of the company above all, she said, her voice a model of reasonable concern. Perhaps a transitional leadership structure would be appropriate, with neither Nathan nor Stephanie in direct control during this difficult period. Stephanie turned to face her. That won't be necessary. Diana, the transition is already complete. Charles handed another document to each board member. This certifies the transfer of Nathan Allen's 51% controlling interest to Stephanie Reed, effective upon verification of the triggering event, which you have all now witnessed. There's one more announcement, Stephanie added, her voice steady. Reed Construction will be undergoing a significant restructuring, effective immediately. All subsidiary companies created in the past 18 months will be audited. All consulting contracts will be reviewed, and all funds inappropriately diverted from company accounts will be recovered. Nathan's head snapped up at this, genuine fear flickering across his face. The financial maneuvers he'd been conducting were suddenly exposed. Additionally, Stephanie continued, Arthur Vance will be joining Reed Construction as a minority partner, with a 40% stake in the company. This final announcement sent a fresh wave of shock through the room. Board members exchanged alarmed glances. The idea of Arthur Vance, Richard Reed's greatest rival, having a substantial stake in Reed Construction seemed unthinkable. "You can't do this," Nathan said, finding his voice at last. "Dad would never—" "Your father made provision for exactly this scenario." Stephanie interrupted, her voice suddenly hard. "He knew your weaknesses, Nathan. He knew you could be influenced, manipulated. He hoped it would never happen, but he prepared for it nonetheless." She looked around the table, meeting the eyes of each board member. "I understand this is shocking, but Reed Construction will emerge stronger, more transparent, and more committed than ever to the values on which Richard built this company." James Harrington cleared his throat. "I, for one, support Mrs. Reed unconditionally. Richard always said she was the backbone of this company. Perhaps it's time we all remembered that." Several other board members nodded in agreement. "I move to formally acknowledge the transfer of controlling interest to Stephanie Reed, as stipulated in Richard Reed's legal directives," Victoria Chen said firmly. "Seconded," added another board member. One by one, the board members signaled their assent, leaving Nathan, Arya, and Diana increasingly isolated. Stephanie looked at her son one last time. "The meeting is adjourned. Nathan, Arya, please clear your offices by the end of the day. Your severance packages will be generous, provided all company assets are returned." As the board members filed out, many stopping to speak quietly with Stephanie, Nathan remained frozen in his seat, staring at the $1 bill still sitting on the table before him, the price of his betrayal. The fallout was swift and absolute. By nightfall, news of the dramatic leadership change at Reed Construction had reached every corner of Dallas's business community. The stock initially plummeted on news of the upheaval, then rallied strongly when Arthur Vance's involvement was confirmed. Analysts praised the unexpected partnership as combining Reed's reputation for quality with Vance's aggressive market strategies, a corporate marriage that seemed destined to dominate the Texas construction landscape. For Stephanie, the victory brought a complex mix of emotions. The relief of securing Richard's legacy warred with the pain of permanently severing her relationship with her son. As she sat in Richard's study that evening, reviewing the day's events with Charles Bennett, she felt not triumph, but a profound weariness. "It's done," Charles said, raising a glass of bourbon in a somber toast. "Richard would be proud of how you handled yourself today." "Would he?" Stephanie asked softly. "I just publicly humiliated our son and gave 40% of our company to Richard's worst enemy. That doesn't feel like something to celebrate." Charles sighed, setting down his glass. "You did what was necessary. Nathan left you no choice." "There's always a choice," Stephanie replied. "I chose to fight rather than surrender. I chose the company over family peace. I have to live with those decisions." A knock at the door interrupted them. Margaret entered, her expression troubled. "Mrs. Reed, Nathan and Mrs. Allen are here. They've come to collect their personal belongings." Stephanie nodded. "Make sure they have access to whatever they need." She remained in the study, unwilling to face another confrontation. Through the window, she could see Nathan's car in the driveway, the sleek black luxury sedan Richard had given him when he became CEO. Soon, figures emerged from the house, carrying boxes and suitcases. Nathan moved like a man underwater, his movements slow and mechanical. Arya directed the loading with sharp, angry gestures. Neither of them looked up at the study window. Neither of them said goodbye. As they drove away, Emily appeared in the doorway. "They're gone," she said quietly. "Dad didn't even ask to see us." Stephanie opened her arms, and Emily came to her, burying her face in her grandmother's shoulder. "He'll come around, sweetheart," Stephanie whispered, hoping it was true. "He just needs time." "What happens now, Gran?" "Now we rebuild," Stephanie answered. "The company and our family, whatever that looks like going forward." The following days brought a whirlwind of activity. Arthur Vance proved to be a surprisingly respectful partner, keeping his distance from day-to-day operations while providing strategic advice when asked. The financial audit revealed the full extent of Nathan's machinations. Nearly $30 million had been diverted to shell companies and questionable consultancies, most of them connected to Arya's business associates. Diana Parker had vanished from the scene entirely. According to Dallas Society gossip, she had departed for an extended European vacation, effectively washing her hands of the entire situation. She left no forwarding address for either Stephanie or Nathan. A week after the board meeting, as Stephanie was reviewing architectural plans for a new project in her restored office at Reed headquarters, her assistant announced an unexpected visitor. "Mrs. Reed, Emily is here to see you." Stephanie looked up in surprise. "Send her in, of course." Emily entered carrying a folder, her young face serious. "Gran, I found something you should see." She placed the folder on the desk and opened it, revealing a stack of emails, printed correspondence between Nathan and various financial institutions, dating back nearly a year. "I was looking through Dad's home office for my birth certificate," Emily explained. "These were in a locked drawer, but I remembered where he keeps the key." Stephanie scanned the emails, her confusion growing with each page. They documented Nathan's increasingly desperate attempts to secure independent financing, separate from Reed Construction. In one particularly revealing exchange, he wrote, "I need options that don't require Diana's approval or involvement. The terms she's demanding are becoming untenable." Another email, dated just 2 weeks before Christmas. "Aria agrees we need to break free from Diana's influence. The conditions attached to her funding are effectively giving her control of both the company and our personal finances." Stephanie looked up at her granddaughter, stunned. "Nathan was trying to escape Diana's control." Emily nodded. "There's more. I found voice recordings on his computer, conversations between Dad and Mom. They were fighting about Diana's involvement. Dad wanted to tell you everything, but Mom convinced him it was too late." The revelation hit Stephanie like a physical blow. The story had been more complicated than she'd realized. Nathan hadn't merely been a willing puppet. He'd been caught in a trap partly of his own making, but had been struggling to break free. "Why didn't he come to me?" she whispered, half to herself. "Pride, maybe," Emily suggested with wisdom beyond her years. "Or shame. The last recording is from Christmas Eve morning. Diana threatened to call in loans she'd made to Dad if he didn't go through with the plan to push you out." Stephanie sat back, her mind reeling. This new information didn't excuse Nathan's actions, but it cast them in a different light. He had been backed into a corner, choosing what he saw as the lesser of two evils, betraying his mother rather than losing everything to Diana. "Thank you for bringing me this, Emily," she said finally. "It helps me understand some things better." Emily hesitated, then asked the question that hung between them. "Are you going to contact Dad?" Stephanie considered the question carefully. "Not yet. He needs to come to terms with his choices first, but this does change how I think about the future." After Emily left, Stephanie remained at her desk, reviewing the emails again. The picture they painted was more nuanced than the simple betrayal she had perceived. Nathan had been caught between powerful forces, his wife's ambition, Diana's manipulation, and his own insecurities. He had made terrible choices, but perhaps not entirely of his own free will. She picked up the phone and called Arthur Vance. "Arthur, it's Stephanie. I need to discuss a potential restructuring of our agreement." The conversation was brief but significant. When it ended, Stephanie felt lighter somehow, as if a piece of the burden she'd been carrying had been lifted. That evening, she returned to Reed Ranch to find Jacob waiting anxiously on the porch. "Gran, I got a text from Dad," he said as soon as she stepped out of the car. "He wants to know if I'll have lunch with him tomorrow." "Just him, not Mom." Stephanie smiled. "That's wonderful, sweetheart. What did you tell him?" "I said yes," Jacob replied, looking relieved at her reaction. "Is that okay?" "More than okay," Stephanie assured him, hugging her grandson tight. "It's a start."